Hi, welcome campers. We are very excited to have you join us for this virtual summer camp 2020 at the Benjamin Banneker Historical Park and Museum. My name is Grace.
And my name is Chase.
And we are your virtual camp counselors for this summer. So we just want to go ahead and introduce ourselves, and then we'll talk about Banneker, who he was, and what makes him so inspiring today. Like I said, my name is Grace, and I've been working here at the museum for 4 years, and my favorite thing about the park is that there are so many different historical features everywhere throughout the whole park.
My name is Chase, and I've been working at the park for 6 months, and my favorite part about being here is all the different types of plants, animals, and trees you can see just by walking around and going on the trails.
So who was Banneker?
So Mr. Banneker was an 18th century astronomer, mathematician, scientist, and clockmaker. He is most well known for his almanacs and his work in the surveying of Washington, D.C.
So Banneker's ancestry begins with his grandfather and his grandmother. His grandfather was a prince in the Wolof tribe of the region that is now Senegal in Africa. And his grandmother, we think, came from England, and she came over as an indentured servant. His grandfather came over as an enslaved person, and his grandmother, Molly. What we know about her mostly comes from oral history, so we don't have, a lot of information on her, but what we think happened was she came to America, completed her indentured servitude, purchased land, and she purchased 2 enslaved peoples, and she did free them, and she ended up marrying one of them. Together they had a daughter named Mary, and Mary then grew up and she married a former slave as well, and together they had Benjamin.
So when Benjamin was 6 years old, he and his family moved to the land which the museum is located on now. And what his family did was they put his name in the deed to ensure his freedom for the future.
Banneker's childhood was a lot like other children of the Patapsco Valley region. He worked really hard with his parents because they lived and they had a farm, so they had all this farm work that they had to do. There was so much responsibility placed on Benjamin because he was the only able-bodied son. He did, however, learn to read. His grandmother taught him how to read from their family Bible. So he went to school a little bit, but not a lot because he was really busy with doing all the farm work.
When Banneker was in his 20s, there is a story from oral history about him constructing a clock. The story goes he took a small pocket watch and he disassembled it and learned all the parts and then reassembled it from memory. And then from there, he was able to construct his own clock from wood. The clock he constructed was much larger and had a different makeup of parts than a small clock. And clocks back then in the 1700s were far different than the ones we have now. They only worked for around 30 hours and they needed daily winding in order to be functional.
So Banneker continued to show his interest in science and technology throughout his whole life. When the Ellicotts moved to the Patapsco Valley region to start a mill town, it was called Ellicott Mills, but now we call it Ellicott City. When they moved here, they got to know Banneker because, Ellicott City is about a mile and a half away from where Banneker lived. So they became really good friends, and the Ellicotts really wanted to support his work and his learning of astronomy, so they lent him, books on astronomy, they lent him a telescope, they lent him a table, so also that he could continue learning about astronomy.
So one of the things that Benjamin is known best for was his almanacs. He was an astronomer and also a farmer, and he combined his 2 skills and interests to make almanacs, with the first one being published in 1792. In his book, he wrote things such as constellations, the zodiac signs, the position of the planets, when the best time to plant and harvest was, and he had something called an ephemeris, which pretty much had the positions of the planets that he had predicted for the future. And his almanacs grew to be pretty reputable, and he sent one to Thomas Jefferson, and Thomas Jefferson actually sent his almanac to France to a scholar in Paris. Benjamin also wrote a letter to Thomas Jefferson about the equality of people and work about anti-slavery. We've included that letter in your materials.
So in 1791, a year before Banneker published his first almanac, he took a trip to the new federal territory of Washington, D.C. He was asked to join by Major Andrew Ellicott, who was a cousin of George Ellicott, one of the Ellicotts of Ellicott's Mills. And what he essentially did was he was Andrew Ellicott's assistant. Now what they were doing was surveying the 10-mile boundary of D.C. And back then, when they were surveying, it was, a 10 square mile city. So it was a big square. Whereas today, the boundary of D.C. actually, on the southwestern side, it is now the Potomac River. So Banneker helped by maintaining an astronomical clock, which is a very, very important piece of equipment, and it's really hard to maintain. It has to be just so, it has to have just the correct amount of air temperature around it, and it has to be really lines up with the sun's position in the sky. And the second thing that Banneker did was maintained a good record of all of his astronomical observations for the surveying project. So most of his work was done at night, and this was in February too, so it was really, really cold. So he, was a little bit worried about being down there because he was around 60 at the time, and he was just a little bit older than all the other people who were involved in the project. But he made it through, and it turned out to be one of the best adventures he had ever gone on in his life. And when he returned home, he was just really thankful to be back in his warm cabin again and to have participated in such an important project.
So on October 9th, 1806, exactly 1 month shy of his 75th birthday, Benjamin Banneker died in his cabin. His official cause of death is unknown, but it's reported that he felt sick and unwell shortly before his death. On the day of his funeral shortly after, his cabin mysteriously burned down, and much of his work and his research was gone with that. Despite this, Benjamin Banneker exists as one of the most important figures in early American history.
Before his death, Banneker made an arrangement with the Ellicotts that they would now own his land, but he could live on it until he died. So after his death, the Ellicotts split up his land into smaller chunks and then sold it off to people to continue growing the business and the homeowners in the Patapsco Valley in this region. In the 1850s, a stone farmhouse was constructed on our property, which you can still see today. And you will learn a little bit more about that in a later video. But in the 1980s, there was a big push for this property to be preserved so that we could share it with you and continue Banneker's legacy and continue the learning about his life and how very important and inspiring he is. And Baltimore County was able to raise enough money to purchase this property, and after that, some archaeological investigations were conducted on Banneker's cabin, and we learned a lot about his life from that. If you would like to learn a little bit more about that, we have a nice exhibit here at the museum. We are open right now. We just require you to wear masks.
Thanks for joining us. We're excited to keep working with you for Virtual Summer Camp 2020.